Well, so obviously this is about Pythagoras, right? Because if you're going to combine two philosophies together into one new thing, it's probably going to be something having to do with numbers. But no, this video is actually about Pythagoras' teacher. His academic teacher. Not his actual teacher, because that would have been this guy. Anyway, we don't really know much about this man, other than that he was born in Athens and lived during the 1st century BC. So chances are he died before Augustus came into power, which would put his death around 44 or 43 BCE. What we do know about him comes mostly from one letter written by Roman philosopher Pliny the Younger, who asked his friend Lucilius for advice on how to deal with a difficult father. The main piece of advice Lucilius gives to Pliny is basically just be patient. Your dad's an asshole, but just give it time. He'll get better. Well, or at least he'll die. Yeah, that's the gist. And he uses Sextus as an example of someone who was able to reconcile with their father through patience. Here's what he says. Even our Q Sextius the Pythagorean, though his father was a tyrant of the worst sort, did not hesitate to return home. He won his father over by his conduct and example, forbearing to be angry when he was being treated unjustly, and showing gentleness when he was being insulted. In fact, Pliny tells us that Sextus was so good at this, he was even able to convert his father to Pythagoreanism before he died. Now, for those of you who aren't up to date on your Roman philosopher gossip, Pythagoreanism wasn't exactly a real philosophy. It was more of a religious cult, and there were even rumors going around at the time that Pythagoras and his followers believed that transmigration of the soul could only happen if you abstained from sex and from eating beans. But hey, if you want to live in a tent and eat shit, that's your business. But here's where things get weird. According to Pliny, after Sextus converted his dad got so excited about Pythagoreanism that he went ahead and converted the whole Roman Senate to it too. They became so enamored with numbers. Apparently they spent all their time calculating the length of the circle's diameter and whatnot. So clearly, this story is total BS. Not because the Pythagorean theorem is wrong or anything like that. No, it's bullshit because we have no evidence that any of this happened. But here's where things get interesting. We actually do have evidence that Sextius was famous for combining Pythagoreanism and Stoicism. There's a letter from Roman philosopher Seneca to a man named Lucilius. And I know it is confusing because Seneca is writing to a Lucilius. And there is another character in this story also called Lucilius, but they're not the same person. Anyway, in this letter, Seneca talks about how people criticize Sextius for mixing these two philosophies together and says that he himself has done the same thing. Here's what he says. You reproach me for founding a sect. I am sufficiently aware of it myself. I follow the Pythagorean tradition in matters of diet and abstain from a needless slaughter of animals. What harm is there in this? Yet I think I have improved upon it. For Pythagoras enjoined abstinence only for the sake of the gods, but I abstain also out of respect for the victims themselves. I too have found fault with Cupid with his bow and his quiver, and have devoted my prayers to the supreme ruler that I might never be led astray by those torches which he sends forth, and that I may rely upon the beauty of my own mind. That is to say, he's basically saying I'm a Stoic and a Pythagorean, or as he calls it, a Pyth. And this isn't the only time Seneca praises Seneca. He also has a couple of cryptic lines about him in one of his natural essays. Now, given that Seneca was arguably the most famous philosopher of the day, it's unlikely that he would have endorsed someone who was just some random Pythagorean dude. Especially since, again, Pythagoreanism was more of a religious movement than a philosophical one. If you recall, it was rumored that Pythagoras was a cult leader, not a philosopher. So it's unlikely that Seneca would have endorsed him if he was some random Pythagorean dude. So Sextius must have been pretty important in the development of Pythagoras. In fact, given what we know about Sextius and the fact that he was friends with Seneca, it's likely that Sextius was the founder of Pythagoreanism, or at least that's what he wanted people to think. See, according to Roman legend, Pythagoras traveled to Greece and studied under the wise philosopher Phaeresis. Now there is zero evidence that Pharisees even existed, but that didn't stop the Romans from making stuff up about him anyway. Here's what they said. Phaeresis was a philosopher, poet, and mathematician, and it was said that he lived to the age of 270 years old. He taught Pythagoras the Pythagorean theorem, and then Pythagoras went off to Italy and started a cult. But this is obviously bullshit, because there was no way Pythagoras lived to be 270 years old. Also, Pythagoras was Greek, so it's very unlikely that he would have gone to Athens to study. He probably studied in his home city of Croton, and if he did go to Athens, it would have been after Phaeresis had already died. The oldest source mentioning Pythagoras is this inscription here, which says that son of Menesicles from the Magnesian colony of Croton in Italy dedicated this vase to Apollo. This vase dates to 570 BCE, which means that Pythagoras was active as a mathematician and philosopher during the mid-6th century BCE, which makes it impossible for him to have studied under him. See, that doesn't make any sense. Why would the Romans invent this Pythagoras guy who goes to Athens to study under this fake philosopher Phaeresis when Pythagoras was actually from Croton? I mean, come on. This is Rome we're talking about. They invented an entire religion based around a false premise. that Jesus was a historical figure. Do you really think they would have made up Pythagoras just to make him seem more Athenian? Of course not. Pythagoras was from Athens, so naturally he would have studied in Athens. Wait, I think I'm starting to understand what's going on here. Are you saying that Pythagoras wasn't actually from Athens? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Pythagoras was Italian, not Greek. Pythagoras of Croton was a Pythagorean, not Pythagoras of Athens. In other words, Pythagoreanism originated in Italy, not Greece. But then why does everyone think it originated in Greece? Well, that's because of this guy Pythagoras of Athens. Now, we don't know much about him other than the fact that he was born in Athens, died in Croton, and founded a school of philosophy in Croton. And sure, his name was Pythagoras. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was the Pythagoras who started the Pythagorean sect. After all, we don't call the Pythagorean guy we just call him Pythagoras. So maybe it would make sense to call the Athenian Pythagoras just Pythagoras of Athens. Or maybe he was actually the Pythagoras who started the Pythagorean sect and Pythagoras of Croton was just his student. Or maybe they were the same person, who knows. All I know is that I really hope they make season 3 of the Spartacus soon. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video on Pythagoras, the great Roman philosopher whose ideas were so influential that even the Greeks adopted them. I'm the host. If you liked this video, please subscribe. I'll see you next time.